right, so this is going to be our very first real conversation, so to speak. And I think what we want to do today is just kind of introduce ourselves, kind of what we're up to, a little bit about where this work comes from for each of us and kind of the world that we're seeing, and then kind of lay out we're going to build in public and kind of wireframe some of this curriculum so people can access it, right? And so
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
the hope for the conversation. But I thought we'd just start, Nick, you know, introducing ourselves, and I'll go first, just having done a little bit of the higher education and workforce work at JFF and really thinking about the future of skills that students are going to need. And one of the sort of core places I landed personally was not just through the lens of JFF, but actually like having been a CEO myself and getting CEO coaching and then ending up in therapy and discovering all of these skills of life, or skill of self, as I call it, later in life, and thinking, what prevents us from actually bringing these skills to the younger generation. And we can get into the market a little bit later, but that's where it originated for me, just imagining what education could look like in the future. And then we linked up and just been really enjoying get to know you and learning the science from you. And so maybe you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure, sure. Well, my name is Nick Holton. So my PhD is in educational psychology. You referenced we linked up probably a little over a year ago now, I think in part because you had heard a conversation between Scott Barry Kaufman and I about kind of flourishing, if you will, in education. And that was, I think, kind of the initial overlapping interest, if you will, and it's evolved from there. But the reason I was having that conversation at the time is, I think, very pertinent to the conversations we're gonna have, which is since I was, maybe 12 years old, I had a sense like I wanted to help people level up. That pushed me into education, 15-year career educator. I've taught in some of the kind of poorest public schools and student taught in some of those. I've been in suburban schools. I've been in very, let's say, hesitate to use the word privilege, but it's okay in this scenario, private schools on both coasts of the United States. And a lot of the problems, I think, mostly remain the same across a lot of those contexts. There's different ones, of course, as well, but there are some consistencies. I want to do something about it. I know you want to do something about it, and so I'm going to try to help here by bringing some of my kind of lived experience in the classroom, but also some of my research experience and knowledge really in the fields of human flourishing. And then we'll talk more about it, but anti-fragility. So building the good, but intentionally learning to navigate the unpleasant as well, right? And how those things help people be their best selves.
That's right. Yeah. And maybe just double click that transition that you've made, the new work that you're doing with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Just kind of explain what it is and what you and Adam and Tim
Sure.
do.
Yeah, so as we do more of this and hopefully, build some community and some conversation around this, I think what you'll see is I try to exist in two spaces. I just mentioned them, flourishing, anti-fragility, right? So I co-host a podcast called Flourish FM with a human flourishing program out of Harvard to focus on all the science and the research that helps build the good. And that's initially where I came into this kind of question of human potential, right? To your question, though, over time, some of my exposure to, let's just generously call it dogma in certain fields, right, or ways of thinking. And I think an oversimplification of some of the research really started to bug me and gnaw at me and didn't match up with lived experience. And so I connected eventually with my co-founder, Dr. Adam Wright, who he's the director of mental performance for the Washington Nationals, high-level one-on-one coach, now a mental health counselor as well. And we kind of said, well, listen, if we're really caring about and thinking deeply about human potential, yeah, there's got to be elements of build the good, but there also has to be elements of learning how to navigate the unpleasant and develop distress tolerance and prepare for the inevitable sort of challenges of life, right? And so we started the Anti-Fragile Academy to study anti-fragility on a real rigorous scholarly academic level, but to also then develop trainings, right, and coaching based on sort of our working understanding of the science at play, and to really help people do both of those things.
Yeah, and that's really what's cool about your work is it spans high level executives, like peak performing executives, professional athletes, performers that we know as household names, but also you have a program for high school and college athletes as well. And I'm curious, like as you've kind of walked between the worlds of sort of human development, when you think about your high school students, but also sort of that category of people, it seems like there's something universal as a through line that you and Adam are pulling on. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
I think there's probably a lot of things that are universal when it comes to how people want to feel about the way they're living,
Hmm.
right? And I don't really think that matters too much with age. Of course, there's going to be some variance, right? People, let's say, further along in age are probably going to care a little bit more on about meaning, right? They're hopefully at that point started to transcend self a little bit. You're going to see younger folks be a little more understandably self-centered. They haven't necessarily established their own sense of self-concept, self-esteem. They don't understand some of their own motivators, who they're going to be, how they want to be, what their values are, or even necessarily care about a whole lot outside of, let's say, some hedonistic kind of desires, right? And so like there's certainly some variables, but generally I think we know a lot of the ingredients, and it's things like meaning or a sense of purpose, like your life matters, you matter to other people. That, of course, transfers over generally into like a sense of belonging and connectedness and feeling seen, an absence of loneliness in many ways, which we can nerd out on, over time. And certainly, like, yes, generally feeling good. Most of it, we'll talk about the well-being boost or the happiness advantage and shout out, some awesome research in those areas. But again, I think one of the misnomers is like meaning and purpose and relationships and pleasantness require unpleasantness, right? In order to really be enhanced to kind of their highest level. And so I think those are just, when it comes to universal, meaningful, fulfilling, connected, generally pleasant, but able to navigate and make meaning out of the unpleasant.
That's really good. Yeah. One of the things I've had the privilege of kind of starting to teach college courses and sit down with a lot of young people. One of the other things you mentioned how life feels, and one of the things that kind of comes up a lot is two themes. One I would encapsulate as like feeling fully alive and feeling like they're really in life, like life is happening like through them and with them as opposed to happening to them. And then the other thing
Mm.
that really kind of sparks their passion, their interest, and their the kind of when they lean in the conversation is when I kind of go the direction of like what dreams live inside of you. What are the dreams that you hold for your life, and more specifically, what are the skills that you're going to need to actually pursue those over the long arc of your life, right? And I'm finding that young people today are not guided towards things that enliven them, right? And then we've really done this job in education broadly of focusing in on skills and jobs. It's kind of constructed from the workforce market gaps backwards as we did at JFF. And so I think the country's gone through this big movement where we're now training people in the skills they may need, whether that was the STEM movement or whether that's, trade skills. And that's now ubiquitous and baked into kind of work-based learning and different things. But what students are kind of feeling overlooked on is how are you uniquely you? What do you uniquely want to contribute to the world? And like, how do you actually go make that real? And then what are the skills underneath that? And so those two themes come up quite a bit. And, I imagine working with athletes and executives, like that same conversation is at the table, right? Everybody's got goals and aspirations and passions. And I'm just curious, kind of as I talk over that without having scripted any of this conversation, if anything comes alive for you in terms of those themes.
I think, and you've heard me say this a lot, I tend to view a lot of things through sort of a both and lens. And
Yeah.
it's kind of one of our core values at TAA. And so to your point about young people generally not being guided or always exposed to things that might, make them feel vital and fully alive and energetic, right? And I totally agree with that. That's really why I went back for my master's degree and then eventually my PhD. It's, Sir Ken Robinson, the late great Sir Ken Robinson, the element. Like I saw a lot of kids who didn't know what their element was, which is, so you can call it a lot of different things: harmonious passion, intrinsic motivation, but like things that just drove them. And you'd see it in spurts. And when you saw it in spurts, you'd see some of their best stuff. You'd see some of their highest potentials, but you'd only see it in spurts because the vast majority of, say, a high school or higher education experience is checking boxes and taking required courses, right?
Right.
So, yes to all of that. And what I really hope for people going forward, and part what we'll do, and I know you want to do, is help them understand that there's different ways to put that recipe together, right? Because the other end of that, there's always a dark side, right? The other end of that is the person that's so passionate about the thing they're doing, they're only barely on the other side of mania, and they're not thoughtful about financial security. They're not thoughtful about physical health. They're deep into their thing, right? Like there's steps where that can be taken too far, and far be it for you or I or anyone to dictate that to an individual. But I think just understanding and the flip side, right? What if you're not pushed towards something that makes you feel vital? What if you say, well, I'm not worried about, I think of my wife when I think about this, I'm not worried about my enjoyment of what I do. I need to, whatever, make X amount of dollars or support my family or contribute to the greater good or whatever it is. And they access meaning in those ways, but not necessarily the same sort of joy that might be associated with something like feeling alive. I think they're both forms of feeling alive, but affectively, they're quite different, right?
Right, right, 100%. I'm curious, let me just talk over some of the things I'm seeing when working with young people, but also talking to, higher education leaders. And then I'd love to kind of like map that to what you see when you work with young people in particular. So some of the things that we're seeing right now is, we have a mental health epidemic, I think, across the country. And I'm curious about root causes and there's a whole conversation there, right? I think another thing that we're seeing is kind of as young people are entering the workforce, they may have the hard skills, like I mentioned, but they're having a harder time in this realm of skill of self, kind of like self leadership, self relationship, knowing how to relate even to others in some capacity and be self guided, self directed, different elements in this domain. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing is, you know, high turnover and disengagement. Sort of people get in a job and they may stay in the job, but their contribution is muted compared to the capacity of the individual. They're not engaged. And then to those who aren't engaged, ultimately they churn out, right? So some combination of, mental health conversation, sort of skill of self readiness, and then like what I just refer to as being switched on, right? Like engaged, fully present, fully active. Big themes that show up when I'm talking to higher education leaders as they get feedback from the employers that these students are going off to. What are you seeing sort of when you work with young people? Maybe completely different, or it might have some thematic overlap.
No, I think that's pretty listen, the athletes are an exception because for the most part they found something that, lights them up, that
Yep.
they're really passionate about. Mostly. Some are doing it for other reasons, but mostly that's the case, right? But with young people who maybe have not grabbed onto that thing or thinking on a more communal level about like contribution, we mentioned purpose and meaning earlier. Listen, I think it's multifactorial, right? Because you're dealing with at the same time, all these young people are adolescents, right? Which literally by definition till age 25, right? The brain stops developing. They're plastic as hell, right? They're very
Yep.
malleable. There's a lot of good things that can happen. But again, the flip side of that is sometimes they don't really know their values. They don't really know their interests. They're not even really sure where to get started.
Mm,
Right. Yeah, I'll take an elective here, but it depends on where you went to high school and what they offered. I might take this course I really want to get into once I've gone to, say, undergrad, if I go to higher ed, right? I think the other part then is even if they do go into higher ed, right? You raise like such an important question. I said that's literally the reason I went back for my advanced degrees, right? And at the same time, maybe I'll ask this question back to you because it's something
yeah.
I've been thinking about more and more. What happens if everybody gets to do everything they want to do and thinks they should be able to pursue everything they want to pursue and do the exact work they want to do at all times and love everything they do at all times, which I think you gathered in some ways I'm a proponent of, but is never realistic.
Yeah.
And to your question about work engagement, I want to set mental health aside for a second. I'm not sure I'm super qualified to speak about mental health in a
Yeah.
very structured, right, rigid way. But on the work engagement side, I do wonder about distress intolerance in some cases versus like, oh, I don't want to do the grunt work, right? I don't want to work at a place where I don't feel purpose. I don't want to, like stay on kind of the treadmill for 3 years till I get promote, whatever it is, right? Is that like distress intolerance or is that like pretty reasonable for people who like want to feel good and thrive. And I think we're at this really interesting inflection point, not just in terms of the research, but in terms of the culture, because I can argue for both, right? That me piece can teeter on selfishness, and not everyone can be the CEO and
Yeah.
not everyone can be an entrepreneur. Like we have to have employees, we have to have people doing the dirty work sometimes, those sorts of things as well. And so I think it's a complex question, like I said, multifactorial, right?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I would talk to, any this conversation actually just came up 2 days ago when we were doing some prep with one of our pilot partners. And he had mentioned this very question. He's like, how do we prepare students to that even if you have your job that was your dream job and you get in that job, a good percentage of that job is simply heavy lifting and people work, right? And
Yeah,
I'm sort of reminded of like the choose your hard kind of um,
sure,
paradigm.
sure.
But I think you're this point around how do we introduce um, I don't even know what you would sort of point to scientifically or conceptually, but how do we introduce this idea that anything that is worth doing is going to take an enormous amount of work that it may not be work you want to do, but has to get done, whether that's in service of a team or a company, or even if you are an entrepreneur. I mean, the reality of being an entrepreneur, as you know, is that a majority of the work is blocking and tackling. You get, in order to enable the things that light you up and you're
Hmm.
passionate about. So I don't know what comes to mind, from your perspective, framework wise or dimension wise, we can explore in future conversations. But I think it's an important thing to bring to the table.
Yep. Yep. And I don't mean to paint, and nor do you, I'm sure, with an overly broad brush here. And that's why I said I think it's a real question. You think about those two ends of the spectrum because I know plenty of people who would qualify as quote unquote Gen Z or in higher, just recent graduates of higher ed, excuse me, that are wildly gritty, right? And are doing much harder work and much more of it at younger ages than I imagine you or I ever did,
Yeah.
right? And so I think they want there to be a pretty clear payoff, like for that grind in some cases, right? Whether or not that's reasonable and what kind of leads to that attitude, like you said, is a much more complex question. But we do need to give credit where credit's due. Like there are a lot of young people that have it real tough these days.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of this generation, one of the things that I think is also tough is the context in which they are coming into the working world. So I think we are seeing this we're in a moment of time of significant amplification. So the fractures in our society, like the change that's happening, but how it's amplified on social media is an enormous amount of weight for them to constantly be taking in and triaging and sort of sense making around. I think the rate of change that's taking place with AI, I think it's unclear any particular job path at this point in time, what the longevity of that career path is. And so you're heading into sort of a world in which you're overstimulated and it's moving faster. And I think a lot of them feel like it's almost like you're trying to jump onto a treadmill when it's already going full speed, right? And
Mm.
I think they're trying to figure out like, how do I even get into the flow? How do I maintain myself in that flow? And I think that that's where some of your concepts around anti-fragility become extremely important because, we're adding more stress load o- to this generation and just in our society in general in various dimensions. Can you kind of talk about the difference between resilience and anti-fragility from your perspective?
Sure, sure. So first of all, like let's get rid of some misnomers because we're having a great conversation yesterday with an MD who I think thought of anti-fragility as like impenetrable, impervious to pain, negative affect, whatever it might be. It is not that. It is not that. To be very, very clear about it definitionally, what we're talking about is a capacity to, in many cases, thrive through or even because of adversity. Let's just say generally, right? Now, what do we mean by adversity? Well, we're going to say stuff that's cyclical, not constant, right? Infrequent, right? Not overly intense to the point that it's actually trauma with like a capital T, not trauma in the way it's, overused in some circles today, but true trauma. Um, And so we want to factor in all those things, right? But at the end of the day, it's about saying, okay, how do I intentionally, proactively engage in things that are adverse, uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity, just general stress, difficulty, challenge, so that I can, the word in some of the literature is steel myself, right? Create a certain fortitude for when difficult things come later on.
Mhm.
Right. And part of the reason we like it is, and we'll talk about the difference with resilience, is it's not just the stealing piece. It's not just proactive and kind of putting us on the front foot, to borrow a sports term, but it also keeps thriving front and center. It's not like just do hard shit for the sake of doing hard shit, right? There is a larger aim that I think is oriented towards well-being and human potential. So it's a both and. Resilience, and you're going to get some disagreement, right? But resilience is generally reactionary, right? Something has occurred and now we are responding to it. And in that case, it generally gets broken down into subtypes, often thought of as like robustness, which is sort of that I don't take the hit, versus buoyancy, which is a dip and a rebound back to baseline, but they generally focus on baseline, right? The distinction with anti-fragility is not only proactive versus reactive, but there's growth or advancement instead of a return to baseline. And again, it's going to get nuanced. You're going to have a lot of resilience researchers who are going to say you never bounce back as the same person. You always change. That's probably fair. Whether or not those changes are better or not is an interesting conversation. And again, either way, that's still post event as opposed to thoughtfully, intentionally taking on the difficult things to leverage them. Just a different mindset and phenomenon.
Right. You mentioned this sort of proactive and reactive, and one of the things that, and I appreciate, we'll bring in people who are sort of like leaders in the mental health space because you sort of gave a nod to that. But one of the things that I've heard you guys talk about that I've adopted and I really appreciate, and it's resonating with higher education leaders, is I think we've had a break fix model with regards to the mental health conversation and with regard
Yeah.
to student preparation broadly. And so we're in many ways kind of like our medical system. We're responding to symptoms instead of kind of getting to root or essentially proactively training and getting ahead of. And so I'm curious, like as I bring that up, just in your own work, you had some great case studies with college athletes in particular, where you saw like significant changes in their different percentages across different metrics. But what I noticed on the whole is that the person felt far more proactive and far more positive with regards to their experience, with regards to their ability to navigate the complexities of being an elite athlete, or in a student's case, the complexities of joining a complex high competitive job market. So as I talk over that, kind of like what comes alive for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's so first and foremost, to be, academically honest, like these are at best correlations, right? And we don't necessarily claim these as results. But to
Sure.
your point, right, when we have done multiple sort of time point testing with some of the different programs we've worked with, we have seen significant, maybe not statistically in some cases, but in every case, significant percentage change in things like freedom from worry, which has gone down, right? Coping with adversity, which generally goes up. Goal setting and mental preparation. And in some cases, we're talking about 20, 30% plus improvements,
Right.
right? The other thing about it is everything I just shared is like, okay, well, that sounds like dealing with negative stuff, dealing with unpleasant stuff. And it is, because a large part of being a high level athlete is the endurance of unpleasantness, as you well know,
Yeah.
right? And at the same time, we use it. We've tried different types, but we use measures of human flourishing as well. And what I think in many cases we're proud of is, first of all, for it's worth knowing for listeners, there's interesting research on this. You generally don't want to consciously try to improve your happiness. Paradoxically, that's going to go the other way. What you do
Yeah.
want to do is try to understand what your recipe for a good life is, and then try to like cook that recipe on a daily, weekly basis, and then just the result should be what it should be, right? Um, with the case of the athletes, we try to help them identify their recipe and then want to make sure that those stay at what we would consider relatively high or stable, kind of standardized levels during the season as well. It would expect to see a little dip because, again, as you well know, it gets so much harder, the time scarcity, the stress, the pressure. But we ideally want to see those stay relatively stable, and we usually do. So they're not only correlationally, right, building these capacities to do the hard stuff and navigate those things, but they also seem to better understand what helps them feel good or live well sort of day to day and maybe consciously strategize for that a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I'd love to double click on also sort of the form factor of learning and training that you deliver. I mean, I have thought about sort of this skill of self-development in a couple different dimensions. Like first, a lot of us have not been exposed to what I would describe as like the knowledge of the knowledge, just
Yeah.
understanding different concepts, like whether it's psychoeducation, performance training, the knowledge itself, and then really applying that knowledge to yourself. So like the knowledge of self and really kind of examining where you are in relationship to those disciplines. And then I think it's the practice going into action. And I think as we practice things, one of the other dimensions that I think is critical is the reflection and the coaching that we get from people around us. And so can you kind of walk through the component parts of how you've sort of developed college age students just in that kind of framework?
Sure. And this, the educational psychologist in me would say this is not ideal what we've done, right? So first of all, you're always dealing with this, I think, tension between are you live or are you virtual,
Right.
right? When you're trying to work with somebody or help somebody with anything, because it just changes, I think, what is possible. But also the tension there is, well, for the trade-offs for doing something live, training or coaching, I can have greater reach, right? So we do a combination of both, but generally it's virtual. And so that puts inherent boundaries or restrictions on like what we would call pedagogy, or methods. How do I want to try to relay this information or set them up to be exposed to this information, which is different, right? In a way that is going to resonate the most and be the stickiest. And so, like that, kind of this is an oversimplification, but you could sort of think of two spectrums. So there's sort of a constructivist theory, which you might associate with like Montessori schools up to say sixth grade, to a certain extent, even homeschooling. It is wrestling with, it's building with, it's project-based learning. If people know PBL, it's doing the things, right, in a way that seems to lead to high levels of retention, creativity, innovation, right, et cetera. On the other end, you've got learner processor memory processing, which is basically scaffolding, right? I will, as the expert, try to help create a framework for you upon which you can build your working knowledge, which maybe gets converted into long-term knowledge, right? Long-term memory, if you're lucky, and then gets used later on, right? Either way, and I think there's places for a combination of both, but either way, there's got to be some sort of emotional investment, motivational investment to be really sustained, right? And then integrated and applied beyond just, oh, I could regurgitate this for a test.
Right.
And so more pointedly to your question, we are a little hamstrung in that I have to do a little bit of top down, right? And create some scaffolding, but we really try to have our athletes focus on application and integration. Meet with me or Adam or any of our coaches one on one, talk about some of the things they're working on and practicing. Go beyond, like there's no test for us, right? What were your takeaways from the training, from our content, from our coaching? How are you applying those things? And so we try to really use some of the best elements of both ends of that sort of pedagogical spectrum, right? But the simplest answer is, and you know this, so we've talked about this, is always providing one-on-one support, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I think that as we look to bring this work in the world and scale it, I think one of the interesting things we have is that trade-off between depth and quality of
Mm-hmm.
engagement and just
Yep.
solving for, the minimum viable needs that students have, which still unfortunately fall in the bucket of knowledge of knowledge and knowledge of self, right? We
Right.
we want to build a world in which like practice and application is central to their entire experience as a learner, but specific to themselves and their development of
Yes.
self. And so we run into that challenge, number one, and then number two, we run into the challenge of like how do we scale coaching and support? And how do we really, as a society, rethink the role of getting reflection, getting encouragement, getting accountability and other various dimensions of support so that the practice gets into lived experience and sort of habit, right? And
Right.
I just think it's worth calling out the challenge and the opportunity that we have. I think one of the things that we'll explore down the road and probably bring in some friends of ours that are more AI native than the two of us. But I've had the opportunity to use at least AI in sort of coaching CEOs and gathering, both disseminating insights and allowing them to learn like self-directed, also kind of gathering the data. I think one of the things that we run into in therapy and coaching as a society is so much of your time is spent context gathering. You're asking questions, you're trying to get a sense of how the individual sees themselves, kind of like where their gaps are, where their opportunities are, where they're stuck, how you can be supportive. And I'd love to find a way over time to compress those time cycles so more energy and more capital can go into what I think we agree is probably the most important element in
Sure.
developing skills of flourishing.
Sure.
You mentioned some scaffolding, and I think for today, what we'll do is kind of wrap up here. But where we landed, and I'll make my next video kind of around this is this real framework. And you've been gracious to humor me as I've landed on words that we're going to help define in real time. But they are not perfect, and in many ways, the themes within each pillar cut across the different elements or different pieces of scaffolding that we've put in place. But we wanted to land on a word that was easy for students to remember and words that sort of had some sort of emotive kind of quality to them. And so we'll get into kind of resonance, which is essentially is one fully themselves, right? Do they know who they are? You mentioned values, for example. Do they know their personality
Yep.
traits? Do they know what makes them uniquely them as a frequency that they're putting in the world, right? And then E for energy. And this is really, I think, another thing we didn't cover, but this generation's really struggling in the realm of managing their energy, both attention energy as well as sort of their physical body, nutrition, sleep in particular, blue light. We'll get into all of that. A for anti-fragility, and I can't wait to bring that to life with all of the depth and knowledge that you and Adam and your team have. And L is a word that I hope is provocative in a good way, not in a polarizing way, which is the word liberation. And sort of, I think we have really great curriculum and programming out in society on all of the elements of social constructs that we need to change and transform and correct. Liberation, in the case of the real framework, will be around the ways that we can free ourselves from the inside. So anything from excavating our limiting beliefs to the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell others, and so on and so forth. And so I think as we go here on the journey, you're going to be my science shepherd, and we'll bring in people who can speak into the different elements at greater depth, and it should be a lot of fun. I don't have any
Yeah.
other for today. I think this is like a great introduction for everybody, and I don't know if you have any parting thoughts or ideas that you'd want to imbue to kind of put a bookend on this one.
Not at all. Happy that we got started. And like you said, good scaffolding and looking forward to doing more.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. We'll see everybody next time. Thank you.